Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the world to the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. Today's host will be the Director of Middle East Studies at Marine Corps University, Dr. Amin Tarzi. Dr. Tarzi, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. We have the honor and privilege to host today. Today we do our broadcast a little differently. I will be basically hosting and maybe asking a few questions to our guest, Colonel Michael T. Aldridge, who currently is the commanding officer of the 1st Civil Affairs Group. Colonel Aldridge is a native of New York. He has been in the Marine Corps since 2001, a graduate of U.S. Naval Academy, and he also holds a master's degree in business administration from Boston University. And for us, very important, he has a master's degree in strategic studies from Marine Corps War College. I personally had the privilege of being in the same time that Colonel Aldridge was here in Quantico. He has operational experiences in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Unified Response in Haiti. His biography is very long and distinguished, both as on the civilian side and with his Marine Corps work. And he also is the reason we are here today, and we're focusing on his work from year 2022 to 2023, where as a lieutenant colonel, he was deployed in Jerusalem, Israel, to serve as a military observer with the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, or UNSO. And the reason we are gathering here is first giving Colonel Aldridge's very, very extensive background and working as civil affairs in the peacekeeping side and the cyber side, and his observations and what he saw and what he did during a very, very crucial time, as we all know, in Israel and with the attacks on Israel by Hamas in October of 2003. Sir, without further ado, I will give the floor to you to please maybe, after introducing yourself, to look at, first of all, the U.S. and United States Marine Corps support in U.S. peacekeeping. Is this something we do often or we don't do often? And perhaps going into the mandate billet of UNSO, and then we go from there. Welcome, sir, back to Quantico. Even though you're not physically here, we welcome you back to Quantico and to the broadcast, to Krulak Center, from which you, by the way, have a award for creativity and innovation in 2019. Floor is yours, sir.
Dr. Tarzi, thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege, and I appreciate the patience in making this happen. It was pretty busy in my few months after returning home from deployment, but I think this is a tremendous opportunity to share some of my experience and hopefully gain some understanding for the Marine Corps about, like you said, our support to UN peacekeeping, as well as the current situation in Israel. So I did not know much about our support, the Marine Corps, or even the United States' support to UN peacekeeping prior to an email in June of 2022, where the career management team sent an email to all reserve lieutenant colonels saying, is anybody available to do this mission to support the UN in Jerusalem? You'll be deployed for a year, and there will be some preparation before that. That's basically what a CMT email says. I spoke to my wife, Carly. She had earlier in her life, spent a year living in Israel. So she was excited, and I asked for more information about the opportunity. And as a reservist, once you do that, it's like a fish biting a hook. They'll reel you in. So orders quickly followed, and in August of 2022, I was mobilized for pre-deployment training. Spent about 2 weeks at DPC RSU West here at Camp Pendleton, where I am now on drill, doing standard Marine Corps pre-deployment training evolutions. And then I traveled to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of September, where I met the rest of the peacekeepers that were training for that rotation on deployment. The U.S. Military Observer Group is a joint command inside of the Army G357, which their mission is to prepare and train all American peacekeepers prior to their deployment in support of the various UN peacekeeping missions around the world. So that is where I met Major Reamer Argo from the United States Army and Major Marshall Neubauer from the United States Air Force, who were the 3 Americans getting deployed to UNSO in Jerusalem. During that training, it was pretty extensive and pretty good. Colonel Christian Warner, the commander of USMC, and Mr. Don Lash, who's the deputy, put together a very good training program for us. And frankly, it's great preparation before deployment for any of the UN missions. In our group, there were 3 other Marines, 2 going to the UN mission in Mali, and 1 going to the Central African Republic. Interestingly enough, the gunnery sergeant going to Central African Republic was one of the few enlisted service members that deployed in support of UN peacekeeping. At the time, the United States had roughly 35 peacekeepers deployed in support of UN peacekeeping. There was a move by the Department of State and DoD to increase that. However, some of the peacekeeping missions have closed or are closing, and so those numbers will adjust. Specifically, the mission in Mali was shut down, and so that was one of our larger contributions as a troop contributing country. During that training, of course, there's a lot of PowerPoint UN briefs, the beginning of getting into the UN system. There's approval of your personal history, making sure there wouldn't be anything questionable by one of the host nations, by the UN headquarters and the mission to say, yes, this person can deploy. And then after a couple weeks of that, we traveled to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio to go through the Air Force's 1-week evasion and conduct after capture course. It's equated to a mini SEER course. This is good training. If you ever get to participate, it's basically code of conduct training with practical application. Then we traveled back to Washington, D.C. and headed out to West Virginia for intense training or more detailed training on first aid, driving, shooting, and then a final practical application or exercise. So yes, we raced cars and smashed cars. We shot various types of American and international weapons, and we got some extensive first aid training. So it was really good. And then we were ready to deploy. So in early October 2022, I deployed to Jerusalem with Major Argo and Major Neubauer. And we went right into UNSO's 1-week mandatory training for their military observers. This is something that the UN headquarters praises UNSO about, and one of our projects was to work to export or build out a peacekeeping military observer training center with UNSO's curriculum. It's not unique to UNSO, but unique to the peacekeeping missions is UNSO is an unarmed military observer. There's advantages and disadvantages to that, of course. Yes, I did the shooting training, but we did not deploy with weapons. and it was very interesting. So a little history about UNSO. It is the first ever peacekeeping mission. It was inaugurated on 29 May 1948 with UN Security Council Resolution 50. This came after 2 weeks from the founding of Israel by the partition plan from the United Nations. And this was to supervise the observance of a ceasefire between Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Transjordan, Yemen, and Israel. This has been modified multiple times to give more detail and authorities and responsibilities to the military observers assigned to UNSO. They've added inspections, investigations, and added support to adjacent UN peacekeeping missions, specifically the UN Interim Force in Lebanon and the UN Disengagement Observer Force operating in the Golan Heights. I did not know the extensive participation by United States Marines in UNSO. So originally the head of mission was Count Folke Bernadotte from Sweden. He was the United Nations mediator in Palestine, working to establish the Israeli state and the Palestinian state after the partition plan. However, unfortunately, he was assassinated by Israelis early on in the mission. And after that, the first head of mission and chief of staff, the first officer to have both of those responsibilities was Lieutenant General William Riley, United States Marine, and he held that position for almost 5 years. He's the longest serving head of mission in UNSO's history. Another interesting fact is that Dr. Ralph Bunch, he assumed the role as the mediator from Cyprus. And he is a very interesting diplomat. He's an American, the first African-American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and a long-serving diplomat both for the United States and the international community. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him, and I frankly would say do more research. He's a fascinating individual. Subsequent to General Riley, following him, there was others from other nations, but Brigadier General Byron Leary served as the head of mission chief of staff, and Colonel Robert Rickert also served as the head of mission chief of staff, both Marines. And it was interesting to learn about their stories and their time in UNSO. It was very early on in UNSO. There has been changes since then, and unfortunately, no Americans have served as the head of mission for about the past 50 years for UNSO. Another thing to bring up is 5 Americans have died in the service of peace while serving with UNSO. One of them, and the last, was Colonel William Higgins. In 1989, he was kidnapped by Hezbollah while he was serving in Lebanon. He was and killed. And in 1990, the United States, through the UN, was able to recover his remains. And so learning about heroes like Colonel Higgins and others in the mission was also fascinating to me while I served in Jerusalem. The headquarters of UNSO is in Jerusalem, as I mentioned. It currently occupies what used to be the British Mandate for Palestine Government House and the compound that included that. But the mission, primarily their observers operate in the Golan Heights along the ceasefire lines between Israel and Syria, as well as along the blue line, which is the boundary between Israel and Lebanon. I use the word boundary specifically because there is no established border between those two countries. The mission also has liaison offices in Beirut, Damascus, and Cairo as legacy and still host nations of the peacekeeping mission or the observer force. And then we have a liaison that would travel between Tel Aviv and Amman to coordinate UNSO missions and operations with those countries as well. I served as what was called the senior staff officer. That really doesn't define what I did. I equated it mostly to an international affairs chief in a U.S. headquarters. I would advise the head of mission chief of staff on engagement with our host nations, both civilian and military leaders. I would also engage delegations from other countries interested in the peacekeeping mission, both that contributed troops to the mission, as well as those interested just as members of the Security Council or member nations of the UN. Our head of mission, and he still remains the head of mission, is Major General Patrick Gauchat from the Swiss Army. It was a bit of a shock that I would ever work for a Swiss general, but he maintains extensive experience in the peacekeeping community, and he was a valuable mentor to me while I was there. He gave me a lot of free rein and responsibility, as well as coaching and ability to meet his demands. He had a difficult, I would say a challenging time coming out of COVID, had adjusted the mission a lot, and then going into the war, which we'll get into in a little bit later. I was also the misinformation, disinformation officer. So I had to brief the staff on the policies being developed by the UN headquarters about dealing with that. Learned a lot about data collection. A lot of the missions do a lot of analysis of social media, things like that. Fortunately, UNSO is not the most targeted UN mission in that region. You've probably heard of UNRWA, and they take a lot of the spears thrown at the UN by people in the region. So that was not too stressing. My team was 3 desk officers, all military observers that would rotate from one of our outstations, meaning either the Golan Heights or Lebanon, back to the headquarters in Jerusalem. Through my time, I served with 1 Austrian officer, 2 Danish officers, 1 Irish officer. Marshall was the desk officer from the United States covering Israel. And then I had 1 officer from the PRC, specifically from the PLA, serving with me for about 4 months. In addition, I had a civilian regional analyst who was a Polish national, very helpful, long history in the UN system and in the region. And then 2 translators or interpreters, 1 for Hebrew and 1 for Arabic, so that the open source information collection that my team would do would not just be from English or Western perspectives. And our team produced a report every week to the UN headquarters, and then we would provide briefs and everything to any visitors or guests to the mission. I think one of the ones that stands out, and this was a lesson for me becoming a peacekeeper, was describing, some perspectives that are underwhelmed by, UN peacekeeping missions operations. I remember this was a German delegation who they did not have any troops in our mission, which is fine, but they asked why we did not do more. Of course, if you read the news, there are strikes in Syria that are attributed to Israel frequently, and he wanted to know why UNSO did not stop those. And frankly, it's not in the UNSO mandate to stop airstrikes. And if we were given that mandate, the authority, and the resourcing to do that, our host nations would ask us to leave. And so it is up to the United Nations and all of the member states to decide what is in a UN mandate. So it is very particular and very specific. Our military observers observe and report presumed violations of armistice agreements. We do not determine if they are violations. That is for the UN headquarters. And then if required, our observers would conduct inspections and investigations. What that means is in the areas of limitation surrounding the area of separation in the Golan, both Syria and Israel have limitations on what military forces could be there, and the observers would conduct inspections to ensure that they were following the armistice agreements. And then investigations, an example is if there's an incident along the blue line in Lebanon, our observers would be dispatched to conduct an investigation and determine exactly what happened to report back to the UN headquarters. And that it is the headquarters in conjunction with the member states to decide what should be done about any of those situations. One of the key events we coordinated was a tabletop exercise aimed at reviewing peaceful response to hostility during Ramadan, Passover, and Easter because they overlapped while I was there. There was much high concern about friction points in the old city of Jerusalem, while the three main religions in Jerusalem were trying to all celebrate their highest holidays. We did this in support of with what's called the U.S. Security Coordinator, an office that works in the embassy in Jerusalem that coordinates security cooperation and facilitation of training Palestinian law enforcement and forces in a method to professionalize their security in the West Bank. It proved critical because the sharing of response actions and communications and things like that in a TTX helped understand how different organizations would respond in the old city if there was an incident. And there were some incidents at the time, and it helped lessen the conflict as opposed to misunderstanding leading to escalation. So the old city is patrolled by Israel security forces. However, the Holy Sepulchre and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound are under the jurisdiction or responsibility of the King of Jordan. And so there's different responses and responsibilities there, as well as many others that are interested, of course, in the old city. Dr. Tarzi, that's pretty much a summary of my time leading up to October 7th. If there was any questions or anything you'd like to discuss about that.
Thank you. That was, I'm sure our audience learned much. As someone who has dealt with the Middle East, I have to say I learned a few things. I had no idea that the first long-serving, not the unfortunate Swede who was killed, serving officer was General Riley of the Marine Corps. So this is something that I don't think we hear much about the United States as a whole, in the United States Marine Corps in particular, actually serving in the peacekeeping operations within the UN system, especially this one, which, as you said, Colonel, is the oldest one. My question for you, number one, is you left as the current Israel-Hamas war was starting. As you look back at your own experience there, do you, again, I don't know if you're involved with your colleagues there or looking at what they're doing, and I know their mandate is more on the north and not in Gaza, but the north also is very active because of a kind of exchanges of firing with different types of weapons between Israel and Hezbollah, and northern Israel is being part of it is even being evacuated because of the dangers or attacks by Hezbollah. Do you see any changes, first of all, in the UNSO's mandate? I know they're not armed. There's UNIFIL, which is another UN observer mission, their peacekeeping mission, which has taken casualties. Do you see any changes in that? That's number one. And number two, do you see a role, specifically? You talked about information operation and media and civil affairs, for also to expand at least the learning and perhaps to be ready for the day after the Gaza war, Israel-Gaza war ends, or help bring it to a conclusion? I know this is a very loaded question, but I'm trying to see if some people dismiss the UN, as you know very well, in that part of the world, just because the conflict has been so ongoing. Do you see a role, an active role for either UNSO or something similar in the current events? Thank you.
Yes. So, as you mentioned, Dr. Tarzi, I was there on October 7th. We had, I'll go over that a little bit before getting to your specific question. We had just received 2 new peacekeepers who were replacing Major Argo and Major Neubauer. That was Major Lee Caldwell from the Army, as well as I'm sorry about that. It'll come to me. But they had been there for 10 days, less than 10 days, when October 7th happened. And realized that their deployment was going to be from our deployment. I woke up, it was a Saturday morning, of course it's Shabbat. I don't think I can describe Shabbat to an American. It's when we say the city shuts down, Jerusalem all but shuts down. And so it's very quiet and peaceful. I woke up to sirens, air raid sirens. We know that they do not test their sirens. Those sirens are for actual events. And I looked out my window and I saw the trails from rockets and Iron Dome intercepts. So it was frankly shocking. One of the other peacekeepers, when I called to quickly gain accountability and begin reporting back to the United States, of course it was the middle of the night back in the US at that time, or very early in the morning, but one of them asked, "Oh, this happens all the time in Jerusalem, right?" I said, "Actually not. Jerusalem is not frequently targeted by rockets from any of the organizations because of the holy sites and things like that." And so it had been over a decade since rockets had been fired at Jerusalem. And that's how we knew something was very different. Of course, we did not know much about the breach of the fence and the other aspects of the attack and the atrocities in southern Israel surrounding Gaza. But we also knew this was going to change the rest of our time in deployment and the deployment of the 2 new Americans. So I got accountability, all of those things reported back both to the USMOG staff, which I knew when they would wake up, they would hear this news and need to know our current status, as well as my family. But what I found interesting is shortly thereafter got phone calls for the first time from the Marine Corps, including the Marine Corps Operations Center, asking me if I truly was in Israel and if I was coming home. And I said, no, I'm here on a mission, on a deployment that, frankly, you sent me on. And so, and we would stay and continue to do our mandate, execute our mandate as much as possible. So to go to that part of the question, so our mandate is pretty clear, and our observers in Lebanon, they patrol more than work from observation posts. And so they would still continue to patrol as security enabled them to and report violations from both sides. However, they did spend quite a bit of time in bunkers and in secured areas and limited the patrolling along with UNIFIL armed peacekeepers. So their ability to report and conduct inspections was limited. To the effect on our operations in observation of the Golan Heights, that continued as well. It was, there were people scared. People were wondering why we were continuing in this environment, but Major General Gosha's leadership and direction ensured that we remained vigilant, but also executing our mandate to the greatest extent possible. One of the things that he mentored me about, and I found it very useful, is it's very specific in the UNSO mandate that our mission is not to come to a final peace agreement about the situation in Palestine, but it is to remain in place and in existence indefinitely until a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question is resolved. So we do not work towards that peaceful resolution, but we work on our observation until that happens. And one of the greatest assets that we bring to the region is the ability for these countries that some don't recognize can communicate and can understand critical things and give an avenue for communication. And that is truly what will eventually turn into a peaceful resolution. And so we're not in peace enforcement. It is a peacekeeping mission, and our liaison offices and coordination and connections with the 5 host nations truly do help provide some of the avenues in order to alleviate that. While I was there, Lebanon and Israel concluded the Maritime Boundary Agreement. This resolved many conflicting claims and things in the maritime domain between the two countries, and this enabled exploration and frankly, hopefully soon, extraction of energy in the maritime domain. And Lebanon, as a struggling country, needs that as much as possible, and so they've moved out on that. But that was done at the UNIFIL headquarters. The Israeli delegation and the Lebanese delegation did not sit in the same room. They passed the paperwork between UNIFIL and UNSO observers to conclude that resolution. So back to the war. It changed a lot of our, just day-to-day life. Like I mentioned, I was working to get Reamer and Marshall redeployed at that time. And of course, all non-Israeli airlines stopped flying out of Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv. And so we worked to try and find them a flight and everything like that. And then one of the greatest adventures, pretty stressful, was, hey, Colonel Aldridge, or Lieutenant Colonel Aldridge at the time, there's a C-17 coming to this Israeli air base. I need you to get Major Argo and Major Neubauer on that C-17. Why I was not going home, I had been extended because my replacement was coming in late, and so I'd been extended for a month. But the 5 of us, the 2 new peacekeepers, as well as the 3 of us that have been there, traveled to Nevatim Air Base, which is in southern Israel, close to Beersheba, and we worked our way onto the base. We drove our pretty conspicuous UN van onto the flight line, and we were able to get the 2 majors onto a flight out of the country That C-17 was one of the C-17s that was delivering artillery shells to the IDF. So that's where I was a little nervous about getting a UN van pictured with that. Of course, we had nothing to do with that delivery, but getting the 2 Americans home was a big deal. And so it was very trusting of General Gauchard that I could do that, or that we could do that, and we pulled that off. And so that was a tense situation, but it was great to through Israel and see Israeli soldiers coming out of duty and everything in response. I think another thing that so there were people asking, when are we going to shut down and move to Cyprus or into Jordan? And like I said, Major General Gauchard was very adamant we can still execute some portions of our mandate to an effective level. We will report that back to the UN headquarters and request that we remain in place to this day. They adapted the mission during the Syrian civil war, where all of the observers moved to the Israeli side of the area of separation, but they have since returned back to the Syrian side and living in Damascus. And so, I think it's, tense, but still functioning as a mission. Obviously, as you mentioned, Dr. Tarzi, UNIFIL has a challenging situation in southern Lebanon, and wondering if anything will, spark more than a simmer, as it has happened. But that's where we stand as the war continues. As far as afterwards, researching and hearing about proposals, never knowing how serious or how receptive ones would be to the proposals. The UN should have a role in the aftermath of this. But I think one of the challenges to that is the UN itself. If they don't do some serious reflection, their role as the sole entity to conduct peacekeeping, or its primary role to conduct peacekeeping, can diminish even further. As I mentioned, while I was deployed, our team in Mali redeployed early because that mission was asked to leave by the host nation. The mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo has also been asked to leave. The violence in Sudan, the coup in Sudan erupted, and in discussions with leadership in the UN, some of them were pretty disappointed that the first representative to go to Sudan during that violence was the head of the UN High Commission on Refugees, it was the UN Commissioner for Humanitarian Assistance, Office OCHA. But why not send a military officer as representing, making peace and settling down the violence before humanitarian assistance and rebuilding is endeavored? And so that was a frustration by some. In continuing on the day after, I think they, UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which manages the Palestinian refugee challenges from the Arab-Israeli war and the Palestinian-Israeli civil wars over the years. I think even inside the UN, they need to reestablish their reputation. One thing I learned while there is they manage the refugee status and the support to the refugees. They're the only ones dealt with outside of UNHCR. And so there are different rules and international law governing the Palestinian refugees versus refugees from other countries. And I found that interesting. So The Palestinian refugee challenge is different from others, and it is important, I think, to understand that. So I think that kind of covers my thoughts on, or perspective on, the role and the importance of the United Nations. Dr. Tarzi, I don't know if I missed anything, or if there's something that you wanted to dig into more.
Thank you. There's a lot of things I want to dig into, but because of time, and we will not. But I will. If you allow me, Colonel Aldridge, to talk about, again, stick the day after, because when you look at the situation, you mentioned UNRWA. I mean, it's in the news right now with the attack on the strike on the school, and we're not going to go through the details. But you said that there is a lot of lack of trust, specifically in Israel, specifically with UNRWA, and the U.S. is not involved in that. The reason I was looking at linkages with UNSO, I know it's unarmed, it's very small, it's lasted since 1948, but as we move forward towards hopefully the end of the Israel-Gaza war and through some stabilization of the region, before the peacekeeping, it has to be some kind of a stabilization operation. So there is a peace and security established other than Hamas, and then find a way to see what the future look like. That's work of politicians. But to get to that point, the UN agency most involved in Gaza is not respected by Israel, and as you said, even within the UN, they have some challenges with their identity and where they are. The question was that I have is something like UNSO, where the US is involved, where countries that Switzerland is involved, countries that all sides, not just Israel, but all sides have a respect that they will actually be more even-handed, if I say that, can be expanded. Again, not UNSO itself, but something in that model where it has a new mandate, and or even outside of the UN. I mean, some people, like former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert, had suggested that the day after would involve a force, either all or at least supported by NATO, which again, NATO here means to a large extent the United States. And I'm coming back to our role in there, whether or not a day after, at least conceivably, would involve some kind of a combination of UN and non-UN, where both the people living in Gaza would see that there's security coming in, but also the Israelis do not see that agency that's there, whoever is creating that stability, as hostile to Israel. Am I I'm trying to ask a question on seeing out of the box with your experience being there 1 year and at the beginning of the horrible attacks on Israel by Hamas in October. I keep on trying to look at how this will end, and that beginning of that end needs some sort of a stabilization, a trustworthy stabilization force. And do you see the UN, your own experience, or something outside of the UN, whether it's NATO or coalition of the willing from the West, or a combination thereof? Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Tarzi, we had a few conversations before I deployed and then after I returned, and I was thankful for those. But as you said, we never got to the end of it, and so we could talk for a long time. But to get to this question, there is another mission. It actually, the head of that mission worked in the same building as ours. They borrowed space. It's the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. Its abbreviation is UNSCO, so that instead of UNSO, UNSCO. And so that did cause some confusion, but they are the ones working, even before the war, to try and be a mediator and try to get to some agreement. They adjusted they were founded after the Oslo Accords. They've adjusted their mandate as well, or the member states have adjusted their mandate. But specifically to Gaza, and I know we talked about this, my personal opinion is I don't know of an organization or a group that wants to rule or govern Gaza more than Hamas. And so I think the solution to that, and I've heard rumblings of possibilities, is there has to be other Palestinians empowered to do that, but that also have the ability to counter the tactics Hamas is willing to undertake to maintain their power. It is the reason why the Palestinian Authority does not govern both the West Bank and Gaza, and so I'm not so certain the international community has confidence in the Palestinian Authority, nor does the Palestinian Authority really want to go into Gaza, so it has to be another entity, which could go from end of hostilities through stabilization to developing a viable government system that both secures Gaza, they need to be able to have their security, and also develops and enhances life for those in Gaza. As we've talked about before, so many emotions, perspectives, rational and irrational ideas are possessed by people when asked about the Middle East, asked about Palestine, Jerusalem, and the region in general. And so that, I think, talking is where that gets sorted out. I had great conversations with the officers from other countries that I worked with. I mentioned I worked with many Irish officers. One worked for me, and Ireland is a country that fully recognizes and supports and has an embassy in Palestine, and they have a perspective from their history with respect to Palestine and see similarities. They are part of the solution. I think the Swiss, it is not trying to sound too braggy about General Gauchat, but I think the Swiss are very important. In fact, the day before the war started, I met the head of the Swiss Armed Forces. He had come to visit the Swiss contingent in UNSO. And so I got to talk with him, and of course they're very interested in the region, although from a neutral and an unaligned but significant player in the international community and in the United Nations. Then there were NATO partners, which think more like the United States, countries like Norway, the Netherlands. We had one Belgian officer, and so it was interesting to hear their perspectives as well. Unfortunately, I don't think the Security Council or the member states could come up with a compromise to create another mandate in the region. They might have in my perspective, they might have the ability to adjust existing mandates, but I do think it would have to be a third-party coalition of the willing that could go in and initiate the stabilization, help out some Palestinian entity that could, one, protect themselves from the remnants of Hamas, and also continue to develop the Gaza Strip. The unfortunate thing is the international community doesn't have a great track record. There are successes. The UN mission in Cambodia and the international response to Cambodia is a success. There are others throughout the world, and then there's some other long-standing missions like UNFICYP in Cyprus and UNMOGIP between India and Pakistan. Those are stable, but still undecided disagreements, conflict, but not armed conflict. Potential armed conflict, but it remains unarmed or peaceful. And so I do think there's a role for the international community, and I do think there are some adjustments that the United Nations could make to existing charters, but I think the bulk of any kind of organization would be outside of the UN system, and I find that unfortunate. I find that should lead to some reflection by UN leadership. I am fully bought into the you do what's in your mandate and that's it, because that's what the member states say. But I think that if the UN really wants to, move into its second century in existence, and continue to be a bastion of peace, it needs to do some self-reflection, and the member states who make up the United Nations need to do that as well. I was very fortunate. General Gosha sent me back to a conference in New York. Thank you for mentioning. That's where I'm from originally, and so it was nice to go home. But I spent some time in the UN headquarters. It was very interesting to see. But I don't know how much they think about peacekeeping in the UN headquarters. Frankly, I saw very few uniforms, even in the peacekeeping offices. The military officers that work there, we have a military officer in the peacekeeping office. He did not wear his uniform on a day-to-day basis. And, maybe that's an optic, but it shows the comfort with the militaries and the, really peacekeeping perspectives. But there are many, many talented people in the UN, so hopefully I'm underestimating them.
Well, thank you very much. That's, having worked in the UN myself at the headquarters for 5 years, I second that. I believe in the UN's mission of how it came about and why it came about in 1945. But sometimes you think that specifically on the peace side and security side, it's lost its luster. Yeah, it still is a forum, and some people look at that, and that is important to talk. But when it comes to actual action, it comes short. Thank you for having a very frank discussion. We don't, something from your own perspective, being there in a very interesting and unfortunate time at the end of it for the region, for both Israelis and the Palestinian people, and others around the region. I believe this is a good learning discussion. You brought in a lot on the table. Many answers still remain, and they should remain, and hopefully you and I will get back together and discuss it, and others who know more and have more power discuss it and act on it. By the way, as you heard, other countries beyond Ireland have now recognized Palestine as a state, Norway and Spain. So that reality becomes there, then we have to be some kind of a solution. With that, if you have any last words, please say, and if not, we thank you on behalf of the Krulak Center and myself as someone who has had the honor and pleasure of knowing you anytime you come across Quantico. Please, the last word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tarzi, and thank you to the Krulak Center for the patience in putting this together. The one last thing I'll mention that was probably the most awkward thing I had to do is my replacement at the headquarters was a PLA officer. And so I had to be careful about what I did on my computer. It was a UN computer. I had to be careful about that stuff. And so it was very, very interesting to, be on the same team, evaluate Chinese officers and those types of things. So that was eye-opening and a great experience, frankly, for the three of us who worked with the Chinese officers. But I really appreciate you guys setting this up. I'm open to talking to anybody. Dr. Tarzi, like I said, we shared a lot, and I look forward to seeing the team when I get back through Quantico. That's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Semper Fidelis. Major Gallican, back to you.
Sir, again, thank you very much for your time and your insight. It was very insightful to listen to everything you had to say and talk about. So with that, that's all we have for this episode. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.